It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be in the position of being able to welcome you all here today. Students like Andrew and the rest of the team that have put together this event make deans look good, because we talk a lot about, and in particular I talk a lot about, how can we take advantage of the wonderful location that we're in, how can we be a part of a cutting-edge conversation in which we're really thinking about the intersection of business and politics and really kind of thinking about the future in a new and different way. But that conversation only becomes interesting when you actually have people doing the work of putting together events like this and really brokering intense and important dialogues about these kinds of questions. So thank you to Andrew and all of your fellow students who helped arrange this. This is the kind of thing that I'm just so proud of. As Andrew mentioned, I can't. I in part want to welcome you, and in part want to turn this over to the true experts, the keynote speaker, and the rest of the panelists of today. But as a China scholar, I have begun to think more and more about these kinds of issues. So I thought I might take a couple of minutes to kick us off and talk a little bit about my thoughts on this. I speak to you not only as a China scholar, but also as somebody who's deeply concerned with the direction of the U.S. economy and deeply concerned with the lack of investment and coordination in the industry that many think is the next innovation revolution that is driving world economies forward. And in many ways, I believe we're actually falling behind. And so I think it's instructive to look at a country like China and talk about what's actually going on there. Now, China's been in the news almost continuously since 1989. 1989, China had experienced a decade of growth already and had stormed onto the scene. People were starting to take notice of how quickly the economy was growing. And then the Tiananmen massacre occurred, and people started to think, well, we need to really think hard about whether or not we're going to be economic partners with China. Over the course of that next decade, there were annual debates about whether or not China should be a part of the global economy, or at least be in direct partnership with the United States. Finally, China got its accession to the WTO in 1999, and that was finished as a process in 2001. And then things kind of broke open. Now, recently, China's been in the news because they've been stealing our jobs. So, one example, Evergreen Solar was recently in the news, many articles about it, New York Times story about it, because they're packing their bags, leaving Devon, Massachusetts, and heading off to China. 800 jobs lost, and it's unfair. Right? Now, what I want to do a little bit today is talk about what's really going on here and how that type of thinking is what is pulling this country down. We are not subject to losing jobs because China's stealing them. We are losing jobs because we are not making coordinated investment in the most important industrial revolution that's happening in this moment. So let's talk a little bit about this. This China story everyone knows very well. Backwater, third world developing nation that was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1976 at the end of the Cultural Revolution, storms onto the economic stage and is now the second largest economy in the world. And it's not just an economic story, it's one that truly has a glitzy, kind of futuristic sensibility about it. One that actually just, if you've spent any time in China, you know that this is the future talking to us right now. It's also one that has many images that are captured with it. We think about the encroachment of the West on China many years ago. We think about the rise of Mao Zedong as a communist power. We think about the emergence of a new economy that is developing a domestic multinational force that is competing with us directly today. But probably most importantly, this story starts with our economic relationship with this country. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping won his position in the party, came over, sat down with Jimmy Carter, and really began the era of ties between the United States and China. Of course, that moment transformed once again on September 18, 2001 with China's accession to the WTO. That went a little bit unnoticed at that time because we had other things on our minds. It was a week after the September 11th attacks, and this was something that was just some passage that China walked through. However, at that moment, China's economic role in the world changed. So a decade later, many people are scratching their heads and saying, why is China speeding ahead of us in renewable energy? Why is it that China's renewables are so far out in front of us, and here we are sitting on the sidelines. And in fact, interestingly, a lot of the technology is our technology. Right? So we do have companies like Evergreen Solar and DuPont and some other companies that are building their factories in China, and maybe it does seem like China's stealing jobs. In September of this year, the United States steelworkers filed a suit with our Department of Commerce that was hopefully going to go to the WTO for that very issue. China is adopting unfair labor practices that are hurting the U.S. economy. Maybe there's something to it, but it begs a bigger question. How do we build industries? How do we think about driving sustainability? What is this renewable sector, and how do we actually engage in the process of industrial development? So I was thinking about this some months ago, and I thought, well, when do I first remember this coming onto the scene? I was 10 years old when Jimmy Carter came into office, and I remember when he put these solar panels up as a very big, showy engagement with how the government engages in these issues. And certainly, Barack Obama has talked about this as well. And this was part of his State of the Union speech this year. We do big things. I was actually at an interesting meeting in New York shortly after the State of the Union address. I was with a number of business and industry leaders in New York. And the conversation was really about, do we do big things? We say we do big things. Are we doing big things? It's an interesting question. So I like to think about, when we compare these issues, what's China doing? I like to think about how they are actually doing big things. And if it is true that they're speeding out in front of us in terms of the development of this industry, how's that happening and why? Ingli Solar is a great example. It's a company that I've looked a lot at. And they are a company that has really become at the forefront of China's marketing push. I thought it was a little bit painful at the World Cup to notice that what we export to the world in terms of brands is McDonald's, and what China is exporting to the world is Ingli Solar, the future. But let me tell you a couple of quick stories that kind of put a movement like Evergreen Solar into context. When DuPont was thinking about building a new photovoltaic plant, they wanted to move into this sector, and they wanted to actually develop a presence. They were already building in this area. And China and Singapore heard that they were in the market for a new plant. They came after them. They lobbied them. They pitched them. The competing deals, back and forth. And eventually, they ended up building that plant in Guangdong province with a research facility in Hong Kong. Now, we might think of that as jobs being stolen, but in fact, when I talked to one of the senior people in the organization, he said, I wouldn't have even known who to call in thinking about building it here. But it's worse than not knowing who to call, because when the economic recession hit, people at DuPont got worried. They started thinking, what does it mean, actually, that the markets are hurting so badly? Maybe we need to scale back. And the Chinese government said, what do you need? Guaranteed procurement would be nice. Okay, we can do that. And if you start thinking about what that means in terms of how you can aggressively develop an industry, tax credits alone will not do it. Now, it's actually interesting to also go back to the Evergreen Solar case. Evergreen Solar, they did receive a number of tax breaks and entitlements, set-asides from the Massachusetts government, and Massachusetts is to be commended for that. But they also had a major part of their bond issuance running through Lehman Brothers. When Lehman collapsed, a lot of that wealth collapsed with it. Evergreen Solar went after TARP money, but they were told, you don't get TARP money, you're not a financial institution. Right? So it's not that this company was simply trying to chase cheap labor. This company wanted to build in Massachusetts. They wanted to be in Massachusetts. They wanted to continue their presence in Massachusetts, but it was either go to China, where they were going to get a better deal and a healthier set of investments and set-asides from the Chinese government, or die. Now that kind of brings us to the question of, is there anything we can do about it? There are some good stories. Actually, not long ago, Exelon, another solar energy company, did something that I would love to see happen in Washington, D.C. They actually saw a lot of empty space on the south side of Chicago, having been an undergraduate at the University of Chicago in the 80s. I know that south side of Chicago pretty well. There is a lot of empty lots and empty space there, and it's ripe for industrial development, right? And so they signed a deal eventually to build the largest photovoltaic plant in this, right in the south side of Chicago, as part of not just taking opportunity of jobs and cheap labor in the United States, but actually fueling economic growth. So I think that there is hope for this, but we need to actually understand how these things work, and we need to actually dig deep in terms of thinking about how economic growth in places like China happens. Usually when I talk about China, I talk about 5 key things that are, to some extent, misunderstood about the Chinese economy. I always emphasize gradualism, decentralization, an openness to foreign investment, the gradual emergence of a private economy, and the quiet revolution of institutions there. But there are a couple of these things then that map onto how you build industries. First, in terms of building industries, you need to think gradually and experimentally. You need to have an approach to engaging in the question of industrial development that's not just about free markets are good, government is bad. You need to have experimentation that thinks deeply about how you're going to actually make a move into a new industry. And China has been doing this better than any country in the world for the last 30 years. It has been the hallmark of their reform process, and it is the reason that China has gone so much further in the economic development process in the transition from plan to market than any other economy in its peer group. You also need competition. People often mistake China's success for thinking that there must be some kind of hidden privatization here, because otherwise, how can they be having a success in the market economy? But they make a mistake in this thought process. The question isn't private versus public. We know all too well in this country, with examples like GM and Chrysler, that publicly traded for-profit companies can be just as inefficient as state-owned companies. The question is competition. The question is competition and the right types of incentive structures for organizations, and that has nothing to do with state versus private. Right? And so there are lots of examples in China where we can find this, but your ability to create a decentralized structure in which local officials compete against each other with new kinds of deals is really what drives this process. There's an interesting thing going on in China, just as a sidebar, that the most interesting things happening there are no longer in places like Shanghai and Beijing. So if you're thinking about pursuing your career in renewable energy, think about moving to Xi'an. Think about moving to Dalian. Think about moving to Chengdu. These are the places where entrepreneurial governments are driving the development of a new industry. Suzhou Industrial Park is another place that, to my mind, is one of the most fascinating institutional sectors of China. If you talk to managers that work there, as I often do, they will tell you this is not just the best place to work in China. It is the best place to work in the world, they claim. And there's a very, very interesting story about how that process has emerged. It also requires governmental coordination. The Shanghai the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission is probably the most important industrial body in China. Unfortunately, very little is known about it in this country, but it is the organization that controls the shares of most of China's blue-chip companies, and it drives a lot of the industrial development. The advantage here, though, is that there is cross-industry coordination, something that we are completely allergic to in this country. And in terms of thinking about that cross-industry strategizing, we have a very rich engagement from the government of China in thinking in very strategic ways about how to build industries. Some people pejoratively on the outside call it China Inc., and again think it's unfair that there's so much coordination among industries and across industries, but this is what good market practices are about. This isn't unfair practices, it's smart capitalism. Now, the final thing is really thinking about attracting investors and building partnerships. And here is where I think, again, we need to take a page out of China's books. We need to not think about protecting jobs and keeping them here, or protecting our turf and not having China invest here. Instead, we need to think about the global economy as building relationships across the world and really moving aggressively to build that out the same way that China is doing with Intel and IBM and so many of our other top organizations here. The one final note that I just want to leave you with, though, is that the idea that we can build an industry like clean technology or renewable energy without state involvement and without an engagement from the government is not only silly, but it just is ahistorical. The industries that we have thrived on and built this entire economy on were built with government direction and government subsidies. Without the government investing in the building of roads, the automobile industry would never be what it is today. And so I think that it's a really important thing to think about all of the issues you all are going to spend time thinking about today. Maybe some of that will touch on the relationship with China, but I would just encourage everybody to think openly and broadly about how much we can learn from our partners across the world. Because this is really a time, I actually truly believe that we're at a little bit of a precipice. We're in a dangerous situation in our economy, and I think this industry and this area of work can really help catapult us to the next level, but we need to really think deeply about what it takes to build an industry. So anyway, those are my comments on China, and hopefully that kind of starts us off on an interesting conversation. I thank you for letting me take a few minutes to give you some thoughts. What I really want to do right now is turn the floor over to our keynote speaker. David Rothkopf is the president and CEO of Gartner Rothkopf. And he is also an individual who sits in the Carnegie Foundation and seems to wear a number of different hats as both expert, policy analyst of the relationship between business and government, and businessman. And so he's really, in my mind, the perfect person to kind of kick off everything that we're talking about, and frankly, the perfect person to really help us think about the things that I really want the School of Business at the George Washington University to be built around. This intersection of business and politics is, in my mind, not just convenient in the future for us, but it is the future for everything that we do in the global economy today.